My name is Robin Scott. I'm co-founder and CEO of Apolitical, which is a global learning platform for government. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here today for what will be a fascinating conversation. And arguably, there are few more important conversations than what our new societal contract should be. There's climate change, there's inequality, but these and other crises, none of them are going to be solved unless we get better at bringing ourselves together around shared values and shared goals and rebuilding trust in the institutions that need to deliver on these goals. The premise of this conversation is that the old Enlightenment idea of a social contract is not enough anymore, that now we need to incorporate not just social rights and obligations, but also an expansive view on environment and ethical and cultural dimensions. So that's what we'll be diving into today. We have some really fabulous panelists to take us through this long but very substantial conversation. We have Gabriela Ramos, who has a long list of titles. She's Chief of Staff, G20 Sherpa, and Special Counselor to the Secretary General of the OECD. We have Maria João Rodrigues, Vice President of the Socialists and Democrats Group in the European Parliament. We have Dennis Snower, who's President of the Global Solutions Initiative. Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Arts, and Alexander Wijnands, CEO of Aegon in the Netherlands, or Aegon, apologies. This is a long session, so we're going to try and get a lot of audience participation. We have some high-tech ways of doing that, but we're going to start off with a low-tech way before we jump into what the panelists have to say on this matter. We're going to ask you. So just a show of hands, please. First of all, to get a sense of who's in the room, because hopefully we'll have people represented across the organizations that need to participate in this new societal contract. If you're in government, can you raise your hand? Not so many of you. If we include multilateral organizations in that definition of government, keep your hand up, maybe a few more. In civil society, academia, the private sector. So a good mix of people. Now, can you raise your hand if you think your government incorporates your views? A few. You're actually more negative than, I think from the survey the OECD ran, it's 60% of people do not believe their governments incorporate their views. So this is an even less well-represented audience than the general populace. Who feels optimistic about the next 10 years? Yeah, beautiful, wonderful. Better than I expected. Given you're not represented by your governments, it's good to hear you're optimistic. Who feels neutral, not sure about the next 10 years? And who are the diehard pessimists? I'm sure they're more than are admitting it. Who thinks we need a new societal contract? Okay, so probably around, okay, so that's probably around 50%. Who thinks we're fine as we are? Okay, there's a missing group there. Hopefully we'll dig into that. So for those of you who said we need one, who has a good idea, thinks they have a good idea of what that societal contract should look like? Who thinks they have, okay, that's probably about 10 hands. Who on the panel thinks they have a good idea of that? Alex, we're going to spend lots of time with you, Alex. Who thinks they have some idea of what that contract should look like? Okay. So those of you who said you know exactly what it should look like or you have some idea, your task for the next hour or so is to please send your solutions through the high-tech way of audience participation so we can incorporate those into the discussions. And if anyone is inspired partway through to have a solution, please send that as well. Okay, so we're gonna have lots of back and forth in this conversation, but we're gonna start with just about 3 to 4 minutes from each of our esteemed panelists on their take on why we're here and what a pathway out of the challenges we face right now might look like. Gabriela, can we start with you?
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be joined by this wonderful panel, and thank you, Robin, for putting the right framework for this discussion, because we all have heard about the need to relaunch the social contract, and we have not yet got into a clear definition of what is that we are talking about. Welcome, Minister Carcedo, great to have you here. And also former Minister of Social and Employment are the hosts, but also the DSG of the OECD. Let me tell you that when you asked me to participate in this panel, I exactly started with that discussion. What do we define? And we came back to Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes said we need, and this great philosopher, economist, and he said we need to have very clear rules of what is expected for the government and the citizens to do to live in a society that delivers for good of the people. And I think this is what we need to get into the framing, the good of the people, because this is the question that we are trying to answer now. If the way we have organized how not only the government, but the whole parties that participate in this societal contract, which is people, but also businesses, but also government, are delivering to what is needed in this context. We have a fantastic reference. I think that what we have heard from the morning is that we have many key challenges, and the real question here is whether this contract has delivered. And I have to say that I belong to those of you that raise your hand saying we don't think it has delivered. We don't think it has delivered in a way it was supposed to be. You mentioned it, the Secretary General mentioned it. In the question of a fair distribution of the benefits of growth, we know it's not, because a large share has gone to the top of the income distribution. It has not delivered on certainty and sustainability. We had the worst of the crisis, and we're still at the verge of knowing whether the financial system or the tensions of the economic growth will deliver or not. And it has not delivered on providing certainty for the future regarding the climate change. So I think that these are the three axes in which we really need to focus and think, how do we build up a social contract that matters? I have to say that then you add up an additional layer, even if we have delivered for all of this, no? The economic vulnerability, the question of wealth and income, and we need to think about one of the topics that is core to this forum also, and that have led the discussion, which is the digital revolution. Because even if some of the tenets of the previous social contract, which is to provide social safety nets, protection systems for the people that are not eager or not capable to thrive with the conditions, normal conditions, how much this really is responding to the way in which the digital revolution is moving on. And we are seeing very clear gaps. We're seeing clear gaps because what is happening is that you have people that will be changing. You have a system that have been built on the basis that you will have a job for life. And then you build a set of benefits and entitlements that are linked to your job. And therefore, if you are going to be changing jobs with the digital revolution, if you're going to be your own employer, if you're going to have your own definitions of what are the benefits, then the social contract, I think, needs to be rethought. One of the issues that the OECD has been using as resembles or what needs to be done, a previous time when we have a very, very big crisis was the 30s. And then we got the New Deal. We got the New Deal is a full set of very important reforms and welfare systems, the commitment by governments to provide with health security, with education, with job protection systems, that build up what we knew up until 2 decades ago. But this has been dismantled in many ways, and this is not corresponding to what we really need. And then we need to listen to people. We have at the OECD a very important initiative that we launched. That is a survey asking people what do they care about. Because we always said, let's listen to people, but then how do you do it? It's not only about the formal surveys that we conduct in the government. We launched this Risk That Matters survey in 2018, and 70% of people said that governments should do more to ensure their economic and social security. So this is a very strong call. And at the OECD, I'm not going to go further because then I will take like 15 minutes, but we have been documenting all these challenges. We have documenting how the tenets of this previous social package is not working because you need 5 generations for children belonging to the low-income groups to move up, so social mobility is stalled. You need, you see the middle class. We just delivered the middle class report, and this is showing us how much almost half of our population and the squeeze, we call it the squeeze middle class, have seen the income stagnant, and then their cost of housing, their cost of health, their cost of education growing up. We see the millennials, we saw this fantastic lady in the morning, having less chances to belong to the middle class than their parents. And so we are really working to provide some of the solutions. We launched the Inclusive Growth Initiative and the dashboard, and what we're saying is like, let's just try to rethink the growth model. Let's try to put people at the center. And what do you mean by that? You mean that you don't go only to GDP growth and but to put equity consideration ex ante, you put environmental consideration ex ante, and then you have a set of options that is not only growth by itself, is growth that provides the answers for people and for the environment. And I think in this new rethinking, with our new economic approaches also, we need to bring the social contract down to the core of thinking what is there for people, what do they expect, how do they feel that they can thrive in life, how do we give answer to all these people that are trapped in low-income families, bad education, no opportunities, and then you're stalled. I think this is the real question. Because if you have a societal contract that works for the lucky few, it's not working. And then you produce all this sentiment that their expectations are not being fulfilled.
Thank you, Gabriela. And there was a lot of data in that, but that 5 generations figure, let that sink in for a moment. It's really astonishing. And if the people in this room don't feel represented by their governments, that their governments aren't doing enough, imagine if one is part of the people who face 5 generations to elevate themselves in society. Alex, I'm going to come to you last because you have the solution, and I'm going to instead go to, you asked for that, go to Matthew, who now has to summarize, what is it, an 85,000 word book in 3 minutes?
Thank you. So let me start by telling you something about yourselves as individuals. So psychology tells us that all of us in the end have 3 fundamental sets of motivations. And they are for autonomy, for mastery, and for connectedness. These are a whole body of psychological research tells us these are our fundamental needs. So bear in mind those kind of 3 ideas of autonomy, which we might associate with freedom, mastery, which we might associate with technique and expertise, and connectedness, which we might associate with belonging and values. If you look at research on what works in terms of policy, so meta-studies of policy effectiveness around the world, what you'll often find is that there are 3 characteristics of policies that work. Firstly, the design of the policy, so the kind of technocratic element, the expert element. Secondly, the legitimacy of the policy, the degree to which people who are subject to the policy feel that it is right, that it is based on the right values, that they think it's fair and reasonable. And thirdly, implementation, which is fundamentally around people's personal incentives. Is the policy designed in a way that is realistic in view of what actually motivates people day to day as bureaucrats and service deliverers and as citizens? If you look at the huge literature on organizations and why organizations thrive and why they fail, what you'll tend to find is that the organizations that succeed because they manage to combine three elements. Firstly, a particular type of leadership that's strategic, dynamic, not overbearing, not interfering. A sense of collaboration, of common endeavor, of shared mission and purpose. And thirdly, organizations which give people scope to be inventive, to take risks, to be creative, and that trust the people who work in those organizations. The futurist Charlie Leadbeater described these organizations as creative communities with a cause. That was his phrase to describe some of the most innovative organizations in the world. So hopefully by now you start to see a pattern. And this pattern is around these three fundamental drivers, these three ways of thinking about change, three ideas about how best to get people to do things together. And they are, respectively, the hierarchical, which says the best way to get people to do things is to do with authority and expertise. And the solidaristic way, which says the best way to get people to do things is around shared values and shared belonging and membership. And the individualistic, which says, no, the best way to get people to do things is to allow them the maximum space to pursue their own idea of what it is they want for themselves. And the evidence is that to do things most effectively, we have to combine those three things. And this isn't easy because each of them is internally complex and because, in a sense, they push against each other all the time. And so policies, organizations, even perhaps people, even perhaps you, we are at our best when we combine these core elements. If you look at the post-war era in Western Europe, North America, what you'll see is a social settlement, and I'm more interested really in the notion of social equilibrium than social contract. We find a social equilibrium would exist for some time and generates economic growth, declining inequality, expansion of welfare. This is a system overseen by leaders who are relatively self-confident and with a fairly strong sense of purpose, with a model of capitalism which recognizes the need to benefit the whole of society and recognizes the importance of the social wage, and a strong commitment across civil society through trade unions, civil society institutions, religious institutions, national broadcasters, of a kind of commitment to trying to get things right in the face of a clear memory of what went wrong in the 1930s. Where we are now, I think, is that the modern world is a world that favors individualism. And this is a kind of symbiotic process. The nature of the modern world favors individualism as the most powerful force, but also individualistic ideology has reinforced that process. And the pace of change in the modern world, the nature of technology in the modern world, changing attitudes, all of these things mean that individualism is very strong, that hierarchy is bemused, doesn't know how to do things, has lost legitimacy, and that solidarity feels hard to find. The neoliberal answer to this challenge was simple. And the neoliberal answer was that the role of hierarchy is to expand the scope for individualism, to expand the scope for markets. And as long as the hierarchy serves markets, then markets will generate enough growth, and the hierarchy can use that growth to ameliorate some of the effects that capitalism has on societies. What is utterly missing from that neoliberal story is any notion of solidarity. And so what we have in society right now is a solidarity deficit. And that's what our politics is about. And so there's a left of centre account of that solidarity deficit that's to do with inequality and oppression and elites being out of touch. And there's a right of centre account of that solidarity deficit, which is to do with nationhood and tribe and belonging. And the reason our politics feels so visceral is because solidaristic politics is visceral. It's not about what is the best way to do things. It's not transactional. It's about who is right, whose tribe is right, my tribe versus your tribe. This is a very difficult politics. So I've run out of time, and in questions I can talk about the solutions to this, but I'll just say these two things. What you can't do in this circumstance, which is what populism offers, is simply dial up solidarity. Say, well, we'll have society as it is, but we'll just have a stronger emphasis on equality, or we'll just have a stronger emphasis on tribe or nationhood. That won't work. You have to reconstitute the system as a whole. So a new social equilibrium is going to require us, yes, to find a way of articulating solidarity in a way that brings people together. But it also requires us to reimagine individualism. It means different models of capitalism. It means a different account of personal thriving and fulfillment, which isn't simply about shopping and economic growth. And it's going to require the full-scale reconstitution of hierarchical authority. So democratic reform and reform of the way that government and other institutions work. So we need an entirely new social equilibrium. But, and this is my closing point, whilst we need to think in those systemic terms, and any attempt to imagine change which doesn't reimagine the system as a whole, I think is doomed to failure, yet the method we must pursue is an agile, adaptive, experimental method. So at the RSA we talk about thinking like a system and acting like an entrepreneur, and that's the mindset that we need right now.
Thank you, Matthew. So if we just for a moment take those three key needs, autonomy, mastery, and connectedness, arguably the present moment is challenging all of those. Our autonomy is challenged by the fact we don't feel that we have security, our children might be worse off, and so forth. Mastery by the fact that our job might be irrelevant in a couple of years' time, thanks to technology, and connectedness by virtue of technological isolation, amongst other factors. And I just want to get a sense from the audience of what you think is the key thing lacking of those three, the most important of those three in terms of the challenges we face. So those of you who think a lack of autonomy is the most important, can you raise your hands? A handful. Mastery. Connectedness. Okay. Super. Dennis, what's your take on the issue?
I'm delighted to give my take right after your comments, because they'll be highly complementary to them. I will focus on what's to be done. And I believe that the new societal contract involves confronting three inconvenient truths. And the first inconvenient truth is that economic prosperity does not rest solely on material prosperity. So therefore, we have to go beyond GDP and measuring what the fruits of growth are. We need to go beyond shareholder value and understanding company performance and so forth. And what has been missed that is highly consonant with what you've said are three things. One is economic empowerment, which is different from inequality. People can, if everyone gets a universal basic income, but nobody has a chance of mastery, then they are disempowered, even though inequality has fallen. Then there is, in addition to economic empowerment, social empowerment, which means our embeddedness within social groups of relatively small size, of the sort that we have grown up with through our evolutionary history. And the third is political empowerment, which basically means participation in the governance of the social groups of which we are part. The nation is included in that. So if we address these three needs seriously, these three forms, economic, social, and political empowerment, we get a radically new understanding of how policies should be designed and evaluated. Economic empowerment. If you take this seriously, you should move from a system that redistributes money from rich to poor, just reducing inequality, to one that redistributes incentives, incentives to be employed and incentives to be trained. You find automatically the most disadvantaged people and you provide them more incentives to integrate them in the workforce and increase their skills. There are a wide variety of ways of doing that automatically. Social empowerment. Measure social integration, we have measures of social integration, as seriously and reported as seriously as you report GDP, quarter by quarter, country by country, and promote inclusive, sustainable communities through the evaluation of education and infrastructure policies. So, for example, in the cost-benefit analysis of government infrastructure policies, where is social integration to be found? That is an important question in the evaluation of our educational initiatives similarly. With regard to political empowerment, one point that you made is terribly important, which is their need, because human beings are used to cooperating within relatively small social groups, we naturally align ourselves in terms of social embeddedness within groups of relatively small size. And the last thing we want to do is for all of us to become ruthless cosmopolitans. But these groups alone are not going to handle global problems, so they need to be nested in larger groups, regional and then national groups and supranational groups, and there needs to be a consistency of policies across the micro, meso, and macro levels. And that is basically a big challenge and would be new to politics. What is important for all these three forms of empowerment, economic, social, and political, is a new conception of what skills mean. And that does mean that we redefine ourselves away from what the Enlightenment told us the distinctive traits of humanity are, that we are cognitive creatures, cogito ergo sum, and so forth. Because machines are going to be performing more and more of these cognitive tasks. We are social creatures that have access to cognitive skills and certainly can interact with machines that often perform these cognitive tasks much faster and better than we can. And putting social skills on the same level as reading and writing, empathy, perspective taking, all this can be trained, but we do not train it with the same persistence and single-mindedness as we train literacy. Creativity can be trained much more, and the assumption of responsibility. There we have the three things that human beings are really good at and machines are relatively bad at. Social skills, interacting with other people in a face-to-face interaction, non-codifiable creativity, and the assumption of responsibility. If we rethink education and training along those lines, there is a lot of work to do. So that basically covers the first inconvenient truth, and the second two can be very short on. And that first inconvenient truth was that economic performance rests on more than material prosperity. These three forms of empowerment are important. The second inconvenient truth is that most of human progress, at least over the last 10,000 years, but going back further, I'm convinced of it, rests not on competition, but on the mixture of cooperation and innovation. Human beings have been very successful in our species because we can cooperate in larger groups than apes can or other animals can. And therefore, we should focus more of our education and training on cooperation rather than competition. In schools, measure social IQ, not just individual IQ, and so forth. Within areas of the OECD or the EU, what would happen if every school leaver around the world had the opportunity, financed in part by government, in part by private sector, to have a job for 1 year in a different culture, different religion, different nation, different social class from their own, working on projects that are mutually significant? We would all have a totally different view of what the relation between different tribes should be, that tribes are meant to cooperate rather than come in conflict in order to deal with big global problems. So understanding the nature, the importance of cooperation and innovation within our social and economic systems would be a big revolution. And the last inconvenient truth is that free markets generate, as if by an invisible hand, inequality. Why? Because free markets generate heterogeneous outcomes, and those who are at the top naturally use their economic clout to enhance their political clout and their media clout in order to increase their economic clout. Now, we have understood this in the past by designing competition and antitrust authorities and so forth, but these generate their own inefficiencies, and we are trapped, I believe, in an understanding of where our responsibilities of society should be allocated. The old understanding of responsibility is consumers are here to maximize their utility, firms are here to maximize their profits, and government should set the rules of the game that everything turns out right as if by an invisible hand. That division of responsibilities is broken. And what we need instead is responsibility on the part of households, firms, governments, other organizations for the satisfaction of all our basic human needs. And if we were able to reimagine the legal principles, redesign corporate law, in which we make every company define its social purpose, then measure the performance of that company by those purposes, make its board of directors responsible for delivering on these purposes, and design incentive and pricing policies that correspond to these purposes, then the job of competition authorities would be transformed. Because now it is not just a simple principal-agent problem, cat and mouse, that perpetual war between authorities and firms, but rather a comparison of how the social purposes of a company overlap with the wider public interest, and having a conversation on how to move our principles in a way that benefits society. So in concluding, I believe if we confront these three inconvenient truths, economic performance rests more on more than material prosperity. Human progress rests primarily on cooperation and innovation, and free markets naturally generate inequality, and we must design systems to automatically combat that. Then I think we've got a basis for a promising societal contract.
Thank you, Dennis. So it's interesting how often these conversations get back to education. Last year we had a similar conversation around inclusion and inclusive growth. I think the key difference for me is everyone looks even more worried this year. But I think, Gabriela, you made the point about particularly getting women and girls included in the widest sense starts with education. So with that in mind, and back to Dennis's point, I'd like to ask you all to submit via your iPads or however you're connecting to Bcast, what do you think is the key thing that's not being taught in our schools today that should be? Dennis gave a few ideas. If you could just, in a few words or a few sentences, send those through. In the meantime, Maria, could you give us your view on how we've ended up where we are, and what needs to change?
Very well. Good morning, everybody. Look, the starting point for all of us is that we are here because we believe that we need a new social, societal contract. I will bring to this debate the experience of the European Union, because I was in charge of negotiating what is now called the European Pillar of Social Rights. It was a big story, big negotiation involving all groups in the European Parliament, and I could get the support of 5 political groups, so it's a large majority for Europeans. And then we opened negotiation with the Council of Ministers, and finally this was adopted formally by the European Council. So this is something new, quite promising. This is a very complex story of negotiation, but I need to be short now to start with. And I would like to bring to you 2 main messages. One is about the big question, a new social contract for what? And I believe the what should be well-being. In fact, some of my colleagues of the panel underline should be much above just the goal of GDP. Let's use the concept of well-being. And well-being, we know, has to do with the so-called Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to rethink about how we define well-being in such a way this is, let's say, in harmony with the future of the planet. And this is really a big change we need to introduce in the expectations or aspirations which are driving us when we are building a new social contract. So this is the question about the what. What do you want with this? And then we have the question about the how. And I believe that the how will be deeply shaped by the current digital revolution. And let me concrete about this. Many of us already underline the issue of education. Education is a crucial part of this new social contract. But what kind of education when we are moving to a world completely reshaped by the digital revolution? Example, if very soon, and this is already happening in our lives, in our working conditions, in our living conditions in general, we are being more and more surrounded by objects, services which are connected and smart objects. All this is being transformed by new applications. All this is being transformed by artificial intelligence. This means that we need really to rethink in depth the kind of education and training we need to provide. Because all citizens need to be prepared to deal with this new environment. Very soon, our world will be completely reshaped by artificial intelligence. And we need to have the possibility to choose different applications. And we need to have the guarantee that we protect our freedom and our personal life. I believe this is a big point which are now being discussed, how to drive the digital revolution. And education is the first step for this. And then we see the implications of the digital revolution for labor market. And we have millions of people, young people and people in general, working for online platforms. And I can tell you, with this European Pillar of Social Rights, we said something very simple and very important. Is whatever the job you have, whatever the sector, whatever the region, small and medium company, big company, you need to count on two very important things. One is a clear labor contract with rights and duties. And the second one is access to social protection all over your life. This is important because we know that some jobs which are being created in the digital economy don't have these two features. And we need to be careful about this, because if we accept these trends to go on, this will be undermining the financial basis of our welfare systems. So we need to find a way of having everybody benefiting from welfare systems, but also contributing financially to welfare systems. And this brings me to the third implication, which is social protection. We need to redesign this in such a way that this is really prepared to protect people on the move. People will have several jobs over their life cycle. Example of this is what we call now the personal activity account. Imagine that each of us will have a personal activity account where we accumulate our entitlements, and then we can use them for different purposes, certainly for retirement pensions, but also to have a break in our life and to take a special training course, or to have a family break. So these are concrete solutions to adapt our social protection system to the new world reshaped by the digital revolution. My last concerns, so I'm trying to identify some key issues to prepare this new social contract, are about the difficult question about how to finance this. I really believe that in order to finance these welfare systems for the future, we need also to adapt taxation. That's why you see the large discussion we are now having about digital taxation, because a big part of the added value is now created in the digital area. So it's quite logic that digital economy provides some contribution to finance this education for the future or to finance social protection. And finally, a big mark of this new social contract should be about how do we decide. This is about democracy. And I believe that, again, digital revolution should be used to enlarge democratic debate. Not only to manipulate, of course we know the risk of manipulation is there, but digital technologies can also open new possibilities for citizens to participate in designing this new social contract. So these are my take to start.
Thank you, Maria. And you've raised, I think, well, many important issues, but two in particular I want to come back to. One around the need perhaps for some trade-offs, because as you say, we want people to participate in the digital revolution, but also to continue to contribute and at the same time to find a place for security in all of that. So these are some very big asks. The other things you touched on was technology, and I want to come back to what within technology is the biggest part of the problem, but also what will be the biggest part of the solution. Before we end with Alex, I just want to give you some of the audience's view on what needs to be taught in schools, which isn't. Values is being shared by many people. Also, the view that kids need to be taught to respect each other regardless of economic wealth. The young need to grow up knowing that they will be valued. In universities, students are taught to care about themselves rather than about others, which is a huge problem. They need to be taught collaboration towards applicable and practical solutions. They need to be taught knowledge combined with skills. They need to learn how to learn. Languages need to be taught earlier. And schools must teach social change and activism in order to create the great changes that societies need. Please keep sending those questions in. And Alex, turn to you.
Thank you. I will try to give you a perspective from the corporate sector, as I am responsible for a large financial and pensions company. So first of all, we believe very clearly that the new social contract needs to ensure that nobody is left behind in preparing for retirement. And that's not the case today. It's not the case today because you see a shift of responsibility from governments, employers, to the individual. The word individualization was mentioned a number of times already, but it's clear that also in this area you see a trend towards individuation. And what this means that we have to empower individuals to be well prepared, or to be at least better prepared for retirement than they are today. We conduct as a company quite a lot of research. Actually, we surveyed over 100,000 people in 15 countries over the last 8 years through our Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies. And the insight is, in a sense, shocking, but not new. One of the main messages is that only a very small minority of people feel confident about retirement. The proportion of people feeling confident about being able to have affordable healthcare is even smaller. And that means also that people are worried. We see that roughly 40% of all the people we surveyed say they are worried about their retirement, and they think about it at least once a month. And that's not a great thing, because the fact that we all live longer should be a gift and not a worry. So that's why we believe so much that this new social contract is required, where it's about empowering more the individual. So let me give you a few examples of guiding principles we believe are important. First of all, there needs to be universal access for everybody to prepare for retirement through savings or any other form. You mentioned already, there's whole groups of population that are left behind, that are not at all preparing for it. And access is something where we as a corporate, as a financial services provider, believe we can play a very important role. We want to be part of that. The second guiding principle is we need also to think differently about retirement. We need, first of all, to ensure a lifetime of financial education. People need to be better prepared. People also need to be better educated so that they can change a job. I can imagine that when you do a job which is a hard job, you can't do that until 65 or even 70, which is what you probably will be required if you want to have enough time to save for retirement. So how do we ensure that we can find other jobs for people? And that's where lifelong learning is extremely important. And finally, I believe also that one of the things, in particular in our part of the world here, needs to be changed is how we think about retirement. Today, most people retired in one moment. It's a cliff retirement. So you work on Friday until Friday, and the next Monday you don't have a job anymore. And you feel yourself useless. That's not a good thing. There's a lot of skills and know-how you have that you're not anymore contributing to society or the company. So I believe it's very important that we start thinking differently in a way that it is much more normal, acceptable, socially acceptable, to gradually phase out of working phase. In other words, perhaps work 3 days a week after a certain age, or accept a lower position in a company. That should not be seen as a shame. I think that flexible retirement is one of the things that is going to be of very big importance here, and we need to work all collectively together. The third guiding principle is that we need to have affordable, and I repeat, affordable healthcare for everybody. Healthcare is one of the biggest issues that worry people. Because when you retire, you need to be able to pay for your healthcare. And as was said many times, I think the fourth guiding principle is also here. We need to emphasize much more financial literacy, helping people understand. I think one of the things that at school should be taught to children is about how do you go around with money, how do you think about saving. I have a young son, he's 24, he's working in a startup, and when I even they're asking him about retirement or saving for the future, he looks at me as if I'm coming from another world. We need to make the change because they have also to start saving for the future. I just want to finish with a few comments here. The new social contract needs to expand the partners that are involved. In the past, the social contract was really between the governments, the states, employers, and individuals. We need to expand that to financial services. We need to take our responsibility, and at Aegon we're prepared to do so. We need to take into account, as we mentioned, financial literacy. A number of NGOs can play a very important role. We really need to expand the group of stakeholders in this whole process if we want to be successful. The word solidarity was used, and we also very strongly believe in solidarity. But in a new kind of solidarity, not a solidarity which was perceived as a transfer from one group to another group. I believe in solidarity where we can pool resources, where we can pool assets, and where we can pool risks, so that we have a better outcome for everybody. So that form of solidarity needs to be part of the system going forward, even though I do recognize that less and less we talk about solidarity and more about individualization. And finally, we mentioned the role of governments. I do believe the governments have an important role to play, not necessarily to fund the plans, but also to encourage, to create an environment where there's an incentive. And I've seen recently that governments have withdrawn, in my view, way too much in terms of providing the needed financial incentives for individuals to save. The reality is such, people don't think about saving so much about the future. They will be encouraged if they know there's a financial incentive. And that obviously costs for the governments today, but it's an investment they have to make for the future. So I think this is a very important part that I hope we can get across also further today. Thank you.
Alex, thank you. And out of interest, the survey you ran, which showed how worried people were, what was the socioeconomic demographics of the group you surveyed?
It covers all social demographic groups. We survey, as you said, 100,000 people in around 15 countries in all parts of the world. Yeah. And there are nuances in the answers, but the main messages are very consistent. It's clear that in some parts of the world people feel more comfortable about retiring and more confident that they can afford to retire. In other parts of the world you see that retirement is still very much based on social fabrics. Yeah. But we also know that these social fabrics are unraveling very fast. And I believe that you see the same trends everywhere. And the reality is people are worried, people are extremely worried, and are expecting also support from employers and from governments. And alone, I don't think they will be able to do so.
Thank you. And I think that came out in OECD data too, that both the privileged and those without privilege worry almost equally at the moment about their future. So I want to just do another quick poll on universal basic income, which has come up in the comments and is obviously one of the more radical approaches that is suggested in the context of this question. And it's something Matthew's worked on a lot at the RSA. From the panelists, first of all, who is either, I'm going to ask, positive, neutral, or negative about the potential of UBI or some version of UBI, because there are lots of different versions?
It's really important to understand that universal basic income covers some very, very different kinds of ideas. And the universal basic income that the RSA, the organisation I run, supports and is working on in various forms of pilot, is a modest universal basic income, which is intended to, for example, strengthen work incentives, not to destroy work incentives. And so for me, UBI is a way of making the welfare system one which is more humanistic. I don't know what it is, how it is in other parts of the world, but certainly the welfare system in the UK is incredibly kind of punitive and involves a lot of surveillance and conditionality. And the evidence now is pretty clear that doesn't particularly work. So I advocate UBI as a way of modernizing our welfare system, but also sending a signal, and that signal is that you are respected as a human being, regardless of whether or not you are making today making a productive contribution to the economy, and you are trusted to be able to make decisions about your life. I'm not in favor of the kind of idealistic, grandiose notions of UBI as a kind of license to be lazy and to opt out of society. It's a way of improving participation and inclusion, not an alternative to it.
Do you have a comment?
I'm all for it, but I think that if we continue adding just partial solutions to what we have all say is a whole system that needs to be restructured, it's not going to work. Because I agree completely with you, we are where we are. We need to design policies to cover for the most vulnerable. But many of you said it, and I think there are very key issues that need to be addressed. If we want the economic system to deliver better for people, we need to change the metrics. If we continue rewarding, in the case of economies, just production and consumption, this is not going to deliver what we're talking about. If we think about what you mentioned, Dennis, on the corporate world, I see so many companies that are saying, I want to do good. In the OECD, we're going to launch the Business for Inclusive Growth in the G7, and companies want to do something different. But if quarterly they need to report profits and they need to maximize shareholder value, then it's not going to work. So the point is, how do we do, when you mentioned gender, and I love that, because I'm always thinking that we are conforming to certain analytical frameworks, biases, and the bias is that we have put a lot of confidence on markets. Since the neoclassical model 2 decades ago, we are just thinking that that's going to address the whole issue. The point here is, how do we rebalance that narrative and put a much more empowering state, as you mentioned, with the means, with the capacities, because it's not only raising more taxes, it's how do we deliver the service that people need. And then how do we reframe the whole narrative to put people at the center? It's a very difficult choice, but I feel that all these elements, because one of the things that we say in the inclusive growth narrative, focus on the most vulnerable. I would say, let's just do that. Focus on the most vulnerable. Provide early childcare education, 0 to 4, to the most disadvantaged regions. That will really put people in the same position, even position to try for the upcoming challenges. But that's not going to work the whole way in which this system works. You all mentioned also the question of individualism. At the OECD, we are developing the global competency framework, because the fact is that, yes, you need competition, you need freedom. All these elements need to be rebalanced with solidarity, and needs to bring back to the core of the economic thinking something that we have never talked about, which is fairness. Fairness don't even appear in the economic narrative of the more neoclassical model. So I think that I'm all for it. And of course, in the situation we are now, let's just put everything we can to protect the most vulnerable, while we try to change the way in which we produce policies, in the ways we are thinking about the economy and its performance.
Robin, let me just come back on UBI for one moment, and then I promise I'll shut up. But it is really important. So the RSA, we talk about a civic UBI. And what we mean by that is we engage communities in saying, if there was a universal basic income, what would that mean? What would be people's rights and responsibilities? What as a community would you want to do? And so I think, don't underestimate UBI as a kind of dialogic tool. It enables a different kind of conversation to take place in communities that have felt unable to have those conversations in the past. And if the UK government said, should we introduce UBI tomorrow? I'd say no, because citizens aren't ready for it. You need to address the legitimacy question. You need to think about its implications. So I see UBI as a really important part of the kind of conversations we have about a different system. I don't see it as a kind of golden bullet that solves every problem.
Super, thank you. So back to the audience. If we take Matthew's vision of UBI, which is humanistic, non-grandiose, a tool for conversation and a renewed agency amongst citizens, I'm going to ask for those of you who are for, not sure, or against it. Those of you who are against it, first of all, can you raise your hands? Brave gentleman at the front, the only person who seems to be against it. Those of you who aren't sure, and those of you who would support the kind of UBI we're talking about. Okay, there are a lot of unrepresented people in the audience. Just thinking. That's fine. Feel free to send your thoughts by technology as well. So, Gabriela, you answered the next question I was going to put to the panelists for a quick response, which is, if there is one thing we could do to progress this new societal contract, what would it be? And you said focus on early childhood education.
I'm saying that if you need to do like very important high impact thing, let's just do it. If you ask me, the most important element in this equation is to provide the governments with the means, and the governments need the capacities to develop policies for a very, very changing and complex environment. I will go with what Maria mentioned. I will go for taxes. I will go for really turn the equation and get more progressive tax systems. Because the reality in the work that we're doing at the OECD with the base erosion and profit shifting, let alone the tax evasion, and by all these amazing infrastructure that have been built by tax evaders in very interesting ways that we have just learned in the past decades. Think about if it is fair, again, if it is fair for multinationals to pay from 3 to 9% of taxes. It is fair. When average citizens pay 30, 25. So we, at the OECD, we have work into filling this non-paying, because we work so hard on avoiding double taxation that we finish with double non-taxation. So we are trying to fix that. And just by companies knowing and people knowing that there's going to be rules to avoid evasion, we have raised 100 billion of self-voluntary paying taxes. Sorry, Mr. Taxman, I'm bringing my bill. And so imagine what can we do with 100 billion, which is equal to the total ODA, the development funds that are dedicated to low-income countries, into building this new space. But then I will bring it to something else, which is more complex, which is the politics of all this, that is not so easy.
Thank you. So reform taxes as step one. Alex, what would the one enabling action that could be taken?
I would really focus on financial literacy at a young age. Make people from a young age understand the long-term implications, make them understand what is required and also what their responsibility is. If I may add one point, I would very much agree with your point on taxation. But I think here I represent a company. We have subscribed to the United Nations principles for UN PRIs, where about fair taxes. And as a company, we ensure that we do so, but we also ensure that we get the support from our shareholders. And I think it's important that when you talk about taxation of large companies, you not only focus on the company, but focus on the shareholders, because they have much more power in getting this done than we all together in this room.
Great, thank you. Dennis, did you want to come in on that? And please also give your one suggestion.
My one suggestion would be that we rethink the tax subsidy system by focusing more on incentives. So, for example, if the longer a person is unemployed, the greater the entitlement to employment vouchers, which would make it cheaper to employ this person, or the greater the entitlement to training vouchers would make it cheaper to train this person, with the size of the voucher falling gradually as once you're employed, the longer your tenure of employment, you'd have an automatic stabilizer that works on incentives. And if you would put this into your social accounts, where you can then use this money that is provided for helping yourself with regard to health and education and pensions, then we would be in a completely different world. Just focus on the distribution of incentives rather than simply money.
Thank you for that. Maria?
Well, if I would choose a central idea, it would be don't give up a full employment as a central goal. Probably we need to rethink the way we create jobs and the kind of jobs. But I believe that providing access to jobs and good jobs should remain a central goal of employment, social and economic policy. That's why I have some question marks on universal basic income. Because look, I agree that we do need to have minimum income schemes. But when it comes to the priority, for me, providing jobs and good jobs is more important than building up universal access to a basic income. And this is a big choice on economic and social policy. And I believe this is possible because on one hand, we have a lot of social needs to be met, and we have a lot of people looking for jobs, good jobs and meaningful jobs. So this paradox is always there, and we need to find a way to address the paradox. With a good combination of economic, innovation policy, education, employment policy on one hand. Let me also recall the possible role to be played by the so-called social economy. This is something which sometimes is at the margins, but can provide also interesting solutions.
Thank you. And Matthew, to end that with you, what would your one intervention be?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the suggestion I made at the beginning, which is it's useful sometimes to think about these huge societal issues in personal terms. So Freud argued that the role of the ego is to somehow reconcile the battle that takes place in our psyche between the id and the superego. And if you want to try to deal with psychosis, you need to try to restore people's the capacity of people's ego to deal with that conflict. And it's the same, I think, in society, which is the role of the state, the role of hierarchy is to somehow balance the inherently conflicting dynamics of the market and of solidarity, solidaristic needs, connectedness. And at the moment, therefore, the strategy needs to be to rebuild hierarchical legitimacy. And I've got a session this afternoon, I'll talk a bit more about this then, but I think the starting point there is to recognize that representative democracy is broken. Representative democracy is no longer sufficient to establish the legitimacy necessary for democracies to work, and therefore my priority would be democratic innovation with a particular emphasis upon more deliberative methods of democratic engagement.
Super, thank you. Now, I want to come to the trade-offs quickly because obviously they're limited resources, and we will have to deal with the fact that we can't solve all problems at once. So I'd like to come back to the panel, again just asking for short answers, and please, if anyone in the audience has ideas to this, please contribute. What is the pain we should be willing to bear in order to achieve the change we're trying to achieve? The pain we should be willing to bear. What is the trade-off? Because we can't have our cake and eat it in order to make the monumental changes and shifts that are being suggested by the panel.
Well, I think that's not the question, Robin. The question is, we are confronting a situation in which we know that if we continue with the same way we have been dealing with the issues, it will bring more social fragmentation. It will bring all the problems that we've heard on the environment. We know, we've heard the UN report and the loss of 60% lost biodiversity. So the question is not whether we are going to accept certain pain or not. That will be the question for those that are winning with the current system. And that's where I want to bring the discussion, because the problem with inequality is that it doesn't stop with this very unfair distribution of the benefits of growth. It follows up into having a very, very bad distribution. This is going into what was said in terms of the democratic functioning, into influencing the politics that are being made. The influence of those that have gained from the current model prevent us from moving. And so now I would say it's not about economics, it's about politics. And how do we ensure that the voices of all these people that have lost, that the 18 million kids that we had in the street fighting for climate are really channeled towards a more balanced democratic debate that lead us to better outcomes. My problem is that I see this disconnection when I'm so excited to seeing the kids in the street, almost in tears, to say, well, they have to remind us. And then you go to a conversation in the United Nations, and only 11 countries have provided their national determined contributions, which are not enough. And so I see the disconnection, and so the democratic structure is the one that needs to give the space for a more balanced political discussion, and what are the options and how to pursue them. I think that's a real question here.
I hear you on that, but I think I'm talking about pain in the very broader sense. And I mean, you mentioned tax reform earlier, and I think that speaks to a kind of pain. It means that the corporate world will have to deal with perhaps paying more taxes. So I'm talking about compromises that will need to be made, and that's the question I'm getting at. Maria?
Yeah. Look, usually, sometimes we were saying there is a trade-off between, on one hand, promoting growth, and on the other hand, fighting social inequalities. And so you were asking what should be our choice and how can be the pace and so on. But more recently, we are concluding that we need a kind of paradigm shift, because we are concluding that more than a trade-off, sometimes there is a synergy. In many cases, when we reduce social inequalities, we create better conditions for growth and a certain kind of growth. And so this is, I think, the paradigm shift which should be underpinning the new social contract. So it is possible at the same time to reduce social inequalities, and exactly by that, creating new opportunities for growth, creating more and better jobs, and having a kind of upward spiral for everybody. And we need to go to these new ways to deal with the reality. This is my belief.
So you agree with Gabriela that there are not the trade-offs we might assume?
No, there are always trade-offs. Okay. But my point is that in the current situation, synergies are more important than the trade-offs.
Okay, work towards synergies and win-wins. Alex, did you have a view on that?
Yeah, let me only talk about the area I know something about, which is retirement for the future and savings for the future. I think there is very clearly a trade-off. Today, governments are very much focused on GDP or GDP growth, if there is any. They're focused on ensuring that consumption will be the driver for economic growth, and therefore have, in most parts of the western part of the world, taken away fiscal incentives for saving for the future. And I believe the trade-off is, let's bring in some fiscal incentives, let's allow this to be used to save for the future, and that effectively means a trade-off, because we have to make the choice between what we are going to be able to save today compared to what we're able to save for the future. And we need to save for the future. And that is going to be at a certain cost, and that is a trade-off I hope governments will make.
Thank you. Dennis or Matthew, did either of you have a view on this?
The thing we have to trade off, the thing we have to give up, is that most of the institutions that we're involved in are profoundly dysfunctional and have to change. And I'll just give you one example. So we were talking earlier about education. There was a big conversation about education. I think those conversations focus on what children are taught, but what they don't focus on is schools as institutions. The work the RSA has done has found that what is interesting is the schools that are most effective are effective in changing the life chances of the most disadvantaged pupils are effective because there are three types of relationship. The relationship between people within the school, between pupils and teachers, the relationship between the school and parents, and the relationship between the school and other institutions in the locality. And so the fundamental problem in most of our schools is that they are institutions behind high walls with their own forms of accountability and their own forms of incentives, which almost avoid engagement with wider society. Now, you know, schools that have that kind of mindset, that put up high walls and are only focused on kind of narrow forms of accountability, and that, of course, has been what has been encouraged by global educational thinking for 25 years, they're just going to fail as institutions because they are not capable of developing the kinds of relationships that are necessary for schools to be agents of real social transformation. But that's true of health systems, it's true of criminal justice systems, it's true of the way government works. You know, and so change is difficult, and so all of us who are involved in institutions, the thing we have to give up is an adherence to the way our institution works and to the kind of legacies that we carry around. And you know, I'm not being critical. This is a fantastic gathering, but this very meeting, the whole way in which it's set up, everything about this, I'm afraid speaks to a kind of institutional model that doesn't really work anymore. So I'm afraid the big trade-off is a huge amount of disruption for all of us who are involved in institutions because they don't work.
Thank you. That's a big one. Dennis, did you have a... Moving on swiftly. Did you have something to add? And then we're going to turn over to the audience to put some questions to the panel.
My intervention is mainly a summary. If I've understood this conversation properly, then there are trade-offs if you focus entirely on material prosperity. You make the tax system more progressive, then people have to pay more and they get more and there's a trade-off. But the fact that we have ignored social solidarity and we've ignored various forms of empowerment means that just focusing on material prosperity is not enough. And when you widen the focus, and if you'd widen the focus also in terms of what Gabriella said, metrics, measure social integration, measure empowerment alongside material wealth, then you may find that this trade-off evaporates because something that was a cost on the material side turns out to be a gain somewhere else. And I think the simplest example of this in action was 100 years ago, we moved from societies in the West where 80% of people were in agriculture to 2% of people were in agriculture. Huge transformation. What happened then? Well, we had 2 world wars and communism and fascism, and then we decided that governments need to take more responsibility for health, welfare, education, and so forth, and peace descended in many parts of the world. Now, was that a trade-off, something that we had to give up? No, by widening our sense of what's necessary, we entered a new world, and this is what's necessary now, I believe.
Thank you for doing my job and summing up so nicely. I would just add to that, so I think the themes coming across are radical reinvention, the need to reevaluate the metrics we measure ourselves against, moving from GDP to other metrics like well-being, the need to reconsider what incentives need to look like to change our behavior, the fact that there are trade-offs, but those trade-offs exist mostly within the current paradigm, and if we rethink the paradigm, the trade-offs we see as a big deal might not be quite such a big deal. One thing that struck me in this conversation is almost everyone has reverted to using the social contract rather than the societal contract, which was how it was billed. And importantly, in that societal contract was the issue of climate and how we bring climate into this conversation about reinvention. It hasn't really been touched on, so I'm going to turn over to the audience to put a few questions to the panelists and just in the meantime ask them also to think about how we bring climate into the conversation. The gentleman directly in front of me, is there a roving mic? You're just going to have to speak loudly.
Okay. In English or in French? In English?
In English, please.
So I'm name is Gio Herrera. I'm an expert on adult cognitive development, and I'm going to ask. So, my name is Gio. I'm an expert on adult cognitive development, and I'm going to ask the question. I think I'm not sure someone else will ask. Don't you think that a new social contract will require a new definition of what it means to be a human being? Which means that the Enlightenment had its own definition of what a human being was. They really believed in the power of the mind. If the mind could free itself from beliefs, then you could have a clear view and an objective view on the world. And our institutions, our economy was based on this idea of what a human being is. Sorry, I'm being nervous. Today, we know better. We know that the mind is easily obscured. We know human beings are much more complicated and complex, that objectivity is not that simple. And we can see today that some children and some teenagers are far more responsible and far more aware of the problems of the world than 90% of adults. So I largely agree, and I was really excited to hear everything you said, but do you think we can have anything you talked about happen in the world without having that thinking about what it means to be a human being today?
Thank you so much for that. I think if we just take a few questions and then come back to them, and that's a good one, and I think we started on an answer with this idea of moving from the thinking human being to the social human being. The lady over there, can we take your question, please?
Hi. I'm just wondering why we keep talking, as he said, in the same way. We keep talking as all sit, you are there, and I love it when you say it. If we really want to change, we have to change the way we do things. We keep repeating the same thing, the same solutions. I just travel. I'm sorry. I am saying that we keep saying the same thing. We keep saying that we have to solve the inequality in the world. We have a lot of people that is having a lot of trouble right now. We are so lucky that we are here thinking, and we don't do anything. As far as myself, I have been working for more than 30 years for human development. And as the search said, why we are not talking about other intelligence? So far, neurologists has shown that we have other intelligence more than this one. We have the heart of the intelligence. That intelligence that feels the pain of others. We don't speak about that. We speak only about money, about growth, and we keep saying that. And we have people from the 70s and from the 60s that already talk about this. So I don't know how you keep doing the same thing here. We need poetry, we need art to move.
Thank you. So this is becoming an existential question. I'm going to take one more question from the gentleman over here. To take two more, and the lady at the back. Just please, if you can make it really quick, because we're about to hit time.
Hey, thank you so much for the discussions. I'm Camille Grenier from Reporters Without Borders. And unless I've missed something, none of you mentioned the role of the press and journalism in the creation and implementation of this new social contract. Don't you think it should be a top priority to have a well-functioning and free press in order to do so? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And the lady there.
Thank you for this outstanding panel. So at the beginning, your first intervention, most of you agreed there was a need to rethink and reshape the educational system. However, none of you mentioned the importance of the standardized test, for example, PISA. All of those tests are rethinking and reshaping all systems. For instance, I'm Colombian, middle-income country. All our educational policies sometimes are based on those standardized tests. So don't you think we need to rethink and reshape standardized tests that are shaping policies first? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So can we start with the question of the existential question of whether we need to reconsider what it means to be human?
I think that I can try to go for the first and the last because somewhat linked with my response. I completely agree we need to rethink the human being. And what I said was we need new analytical frameworks because the analytical framework in the economy, I'm not talking about philosophy and many other human activities that are very following their own development. In the economics, we only focus on one aspect of the human behavior, which is to produce profit, to be competitive, to go for competition, to greedy. Being greedy is part of the definition of the neoclassical economics, and that's the nature, that's your nature as human being. And I completely agree with you. I think that's part of the human nature. We know it. But the other part of the human nature, who is more looking with empathy, that has solidarity, that cares about others, the caring part of the human being needs to be core to the new definition of the economic discipline. This is what we are talking about, not in a philosophical term, because I think this is too high. And this links to the education system, and I want to answer also to the third question that we're not doing anything. I think that you cannot escape the fact that the education system needs to provide the best education in maths. Kids need to know math. They need to know how to read. They need to know how to talk. Language is so important because it's not the tool, it's a window to know other ways in which other people think. But the PISA report is now developing a framework, knowing that we can not only focus on those things that get into the do, we also need to talk about the self. And we are developing the global competencies framework that is trying to, this is more difficult. Tell your teachers, it's more difficult to teach kids to understand others, to show empathy, to try to live in a multicultural world and do not believe that your way is the only way or the best way, but try to open the mind and to look for other ways of looking at things. This multiculturality that we're trying to introduce in the global competencies framework leads to empathy, leads to understanding, leads to all these values that we're saying that are lacking in some of the systems. So we are trying, it's not an easy choice, but the most important aspect of the global competencies is awareness and it's agency, which goes back to what we have been talking here. But how do you teach agency? This is not something that you find in the books, but this is something that really needs to bring forth. Let me just finish by something that Kailash Satyarthi, who is one of our best friends here in the OECD, saving children from slavery. He just goes that, he doesn't think about philosophy, he just goes and saves children. He told me once, we have globalized everything. We have globalized trade, we have globalized investment, why don't we globalize compassion? Which is beyond empathy, because it's empathy that leads to action. And that's where we want to go.
That's beautiful. Who here agrees that we need to reconsider what it means to be human, what's most important in order to solve this challenge? Okay, so about half of you. Thank you. Would anyone like to tackle the media point that was made? I think Dennis had something to say on that.
Very briefly, if we put the conversation on the media into the context of our discussion here, then I think we need to develop a new understanding of where the responsibilities of media lie. If we believe that we should train compassion with the same deliberateness as we train literacy, then the media have a responsibility for making this a more cooperative and less conflictual world. And that gets us into a core problem of the media. The media are here to attract attention. And the way you attract attention is by focusing on threats, because evolutionarily we naturally focus on threats. And threats lead to conflict. And so finding a new societal contract in which the media manage to divorce themselves from conflicts of interest, both with regard to their advertisers and with regard to their need for producing threats, is something we desperately need to focus on.
Thank you. And just to sound a note of optimism, I think the solutions journalism movement is starting to show that there is appetite for what's working, even if it doesn't always grab the headlines. I think we've got time for one more question. The gentleman over there has had his hand up a long time. Please, sir, if you could just make it very brief, because I want to turn over to the panel afterwards to give their final thoughts.
Oui, bonsoir. Merci. Je parlerai en français.
Yes, good morning. The social contract. I come from a continent where today there are people who cannot go to school because the main issue is living. So first and foremost, you have to eat. There are issues, conflicts, wars in this continent, and there are still people who are struggling to find food. So it's very good to try to define a social and societal contract today, but it must take into consideration the fact that we are living in a world where the population is doubling. Everything is great, everything is growing, but Africa remains poor. So should this social contract be drafted without this continent? Should this continent be left aside? Societies are growing richer and richer, are growing and looking to get richer and richer, paying less and less taxes. I think this contract that we are drafting must take into consideration all of these issues to draft a new code for a better world.
I'd like to take that.
Look, je vais répondre peut-être en
maybe I'll answer in French. So to remain in the same language. I absolutely agree with you, sir. Africa, to me, is the ultimate test for the planet regarding all the issues that were just raised. But in order to do that, we need to work hand in hand with Africans. And I should like to establish a link between two questions that were just raised, meaning, namely, should we see each of us?
Yes, we must. Because all of a sudden we understand that we are part of a planet we need to protect and we need to respect. And we understood there is a big challenge there called climate change. Children understand this very well, you are right. And we know because of this, we need to change the way we produce and the way we consume. We are launching a long-term transition, for sure. Otherwise, the planet will not survive. But then we can to the question of the social contract, because we need to find a way to conduct this transition with social fairness. When we change the way industry operates, because this is polluting, we are destroying jobs. We'll destroy many jobs because they are no longer sustainable. But we need to find a way to replace the jobs with sustainable jobs. And when we are changing the way we consume, because we are making pollution, we need to find a way to change to a new lifestyle which is not polluting. I believe that Africa will be the biggest challenge for this. Because if we want Africa to have the same chances of development of the rest of the world, we need to work with Africa to find these smart ways to conduct the transition in a fair way. So this is my comment.
Thank you, Maria. And we're at time, so I'm going to let you have fittingly the last word because it does incorporate the question of climate. Please give a big round of applause to the excellent panelists, and thank you for your time.
Right.